Today, we're going to talk about a story that sits right at the intersection of politics, procurement, and the future of intelligence itself. Because it's not just a headline about one company getting frozen out of government work. It's a window into how the United States may decide what kind of AI it wants, who gets to build it, and what safe and useful even mean when software increasingly behaves like a thinking system. The report? President Donald Trump has ordered U.S. agencies to stop using Anthropic technology. The framing? A clash over AI safety. And if you're thinking, okay, another Washington fight, I want to slow that down, because this particular fight hints at something bigger than red team memos and vendor contracts. It hints at a future where AI policy isn't just regulation, it's power, where the ability to decide which models get deployed, which companies get certified, and which guardrails are acceptable becomes a form of national strategy. Let's start with the basics. Anthropic is one of the major U.S. AI labs, alongside OpenAI, Google DeepMind, and others. Their models, Claude being the name most people recognize, are built and marketed with a strong emphasis on AI safety. In plain English, that means aligning model behavior to reduce harmful outputs, hardening systems against misuse, and trying to prevent unintended consequences as capability rises. That posture has supporters and critics. Supporters argue that guardrails are essential when models can generate code, advise on chemistry, persuade people at scale, and rapidly adapt to new tasks. Critics sometimes argue safety talk becomes a smokescreen for control, censorship, or simply competitive positioning, especially when safety policies overlap with content moderation, political speech, or restrictions on what the model can do. Now put that into the procurement context. Stop using Anthropic technology is, on its face, an operational directive. It says federal agencies should not run these models, should not integrate them into workflows, should not buy the product, and should not build around it. And the reason matters. If the justification is they're unsafe, that's one kind of policy signal. If the justification is they're too restrictive, that's another. And if the justification is more political, punishment for a perceived ideology, or a response to lobbying or alliances, that's a third kind of signal entirely. Regardless of which explanation you believe, the consequences play out the same way. Government decisions can reshape the AI market. Federal procurement isn't just a customer relationship. It's legitimacy, it's revenue, it's access to use cases that drive model improvement, it's the inside track on standards. When government picks winners and losers in AI, it's not just allocating contracts, it's effectively shaping the ecosystem that may define how intelligence is deployed across society. So let's unpack the clash over AI safety, because that phrase can mean multiple competing things. In one reading, it's a clash over whether safety is being taken seriously enough. This camp says models are getting more powerful, and power without constraint is dangerous. They point to risks that range from everyday harms, scams, harassment, misinformation, to more structural risks, cyber attack enablement, automated vulnerability discovery, bioweapon knowledge diffusion, runaway autonomous agents, and the slow erosion of trust in information itself. Their view is that guardrails aren't a nice-to-have. They're a prerequisite for deploying AI at scale, especially inside critical government functions. In another reading, it's a clash over whether safety has become a euphemism for control. This camp says, the moment AI systems become gatekeepers of knowledge with built-in rules about what can be asked or said, we have a new kind of institutional censorship, one outsourced to a model provider. They worry about ideological bias embedded in training data and reinforcement processes. They worry about opaque refusals. They worry that safety becomes a narrative that justifies limiting competition because only the biggest labs can afford compliance and red teaming, and smaller players get squeezed out.
And there's a third reading that doesn't get said out loud, but it's often present. Safety can mean safety for whom? Safety for users, safety for the public, safety for the political establishment, safety for national security agencies, safety for corporate partners, safety for incumbents. When those definitions diverge, the word safety stops being a technical term and becomes a political weapon. A government order targeting a specific AI company, rather than setting a neutral standard that any vendor can meet, amplifies that politicization. Even if there are substantive reasons, it sends a message that model governance can swing with elections and executive preferences. That's important because AI infrastructure is becoming like electricity or the internet. Once it's embedded, you don't swap it out casually. Yet if procurement is whiplashing between vendors every 4 years, the public sector becomes a testbed not for stable governance, but for partisan toggling. Let's talk about what using Anthropic technology might actually mean in day-to-day government work, because there's a tendency to imagine agencies either use AI or don't. In reality, AI enters through lots of doors. It could be direct use, a contract where an agency uses Claude for document summarization, drafting, translation, or internal knowledge search. It could be indirect, contractors using Anthropic models to deliver services, say analysis, customer support, or software development, where the model is embedded in the vendor's tooling. It could be a cloud marketplace purchase, where models are offered through a platform and integrated into data pipelines. It could be pilot programs and proofs of concept that never make headlines, but teach agencies how to work with AI. A stop using directive might touch all of that, depending on how broad it is and how it's enforced. And enforcement is a big deal. If this is a procurement ban, agencies may have to certify that they are not using the vendor. Contractors might be forced to switch providers mid-project. Existing systems might need to be migrated. People who are used to one model's behavior and safety profile might have to adjust to another model. And because models differ, sometimes dramatically, in how they respond, what they refuse, and how they reason, the choice of model can change the output of government work in subtle ways. That might sound trivial until you realize that subtle differences in analysis and drafting can become real differences in policy memos, investigative leads, benefits adjudication notes, and public communications. Now, some people are going to ask, isn't all of this just a fight about woke AI versus uncensored AI? That's the pop culture version of the debate. It's not totally imaginary. Models do refuse things, and the refusal patterns can map onto political fault lines, but it's incomplete. The deeper question is, what do we want government AI to be optimized for? If you optimize for compliance and risk minimization, you get models that refuse more, hedge more, and sometimes frustrate users. If you optimize for maximal helpfulness, you can end up with models that are easier to jailbreak, more willing to provide dangerous instructions, and more likely to hallucinate confidently. If you optimize for speed and cost, you might sacrifice safety research, monitoring, and auditing. If you optimize for ideological neutrality, you run into the fact that neutrality is contested, and training data reflects a world with values embedded everywhere. So when a political figure or administration takes a stand against a safety-first lab, the subtext could be, we believe these restrictions are excessive, or biased, or misaligned with our governance philosophy. But the trade-off is, removing a safety-first vendor doesn't remove the safety problem. It just changes whose safety philosophy becomes dominant. That brings us to a key point. Government doesn't just consume AI. Government sets the rules of the road for AI. Procurement decisions are policy decisions, even when they're framed as operational.
Imagine a future where the federal government develops a standardized AI model certification process, something like a UL label for AI, or a FedRAMP-like framework but tuned for models. If the government instead uses ad hoc blacklists or politically directed bans, it's harder to build stable standards. Vendors will focus on surviving political cycles rather than meeting clear technical criteria, and that could slow down real safety progress because the incentive is to lobby, not to engineer. On the other hand, if the critique is that AI safety is being used to justify viewpoint control, then a government ban could be framed as protecting free expression or preventing ideological capture. But again, government deciding which models are ideologically acceptable is also a form of control. It just moves the control point. The moment state power picks models based on perceived political alignment, you've turned the model layer into a political battlefield. Let's step back from the politics for a second and talk about the technology and the trajectory, because the intro and outro theme today is AI to AGI to ASI, and this story is a microcosm of that arc. Right now, most of what we call AI in consumer and enterprise settings is narrow in the sense that it doesn't have a persistent self, it doesn't autonomously pursue long-term goals reliably, and it doesn't genuinely understand in a human way. But it's broad in applicability. It can write, code, reason, plan, and converse across domains. That's why it feels like a general tool, even if it's not general intelligence in the strict sense. AGI, artificial general intelligence, is the term people use when the system can perform most cognitive tasks at or above human level, across domains with adaptability. There's no single agreed-upon test, but the intuition is, if you can drop it into almost any knowledge work role and it can learn the job quickly, you're in AGI territory. ASI, artificial superintelligence, is beyond that, not just human level, but far above human level in most relevant domains, including scientific discovery, strategic planning, persuasion, and technology development. ASI is the scenario where the system becomes a dominant problem solver, and therefore a dominant power. Why does a procurement fight over one vendor matter in this trajectory? Because the institutions we build now, how we choose vendors, how we audit systems, how we handle model refusals, how we define safe, how we respond when AI conflicts with politics, those institutions will either scale into the AGI era or break under its pressure. If we can't even agree on standards for today's models, models that still hallucinate, that still need human oversight, what happens when we get systems that are dramatically more persuasive, more autonomous, and more capable? If safety is already a partisan word, what happens when safety measures are the difference between a contained system and one that can replicate, self-improve, or manipulate at scale? This is why the governance layer matters, and in the US, governance is often shaped less by a single AI law than by a patchwork: executive orders, procurement rules, agency guidance, court cases, and pressure campaigns. So let's talk incentives. AI labs have incentives to win enterprise and government customers. Government has incentives to reduce risk, avoid scandals, and maintain public trust. Politicians have incentives to signal strength, punish perceived enemies, and align with donors and constituencies. National security agencies have incentives to maintain advantage and control sensitive capabilities. Civil society has incentives to prevent harms and protect rights. When these incentives collide, you get policy that looks inconsistent. One moment AI is a strategic priority, the next moment a vendor is frozen out. One moment safety is paramount, the next moment safety is framed as censorship.
And in that environment, AI safety becomes a contested territory. For some, safety means restricting outputs and monitoring usage. For others, safety means preventing centralized control and ensuring systems can't be used as political filters. For still others, safety means making sure the US wins the global race against rivals, so safety is subordinate to speed. Here's the uncomfortable truth. All of these definitions contain something legitimate. Output restrictions can prevent real harm. Over-restriction can suppress legitimate inquiry and embed bias. Centralization can improve monitoring and accountability. Centralization can also create choke points and single points of failure. Moving fast can preserve geopolitical advantage. Moving too fast can lock in unsafe infrastructure. That's why vendor bans are blunt instruments. They might be justified in narrow cases, say if there's credible evidence of security vulnerabilities, improper data handling, or unacceptable compliance failures. But if the root issue is disagreement about safety philosophy, a ban doesn't resolve the disagreement, it escalates it. If you want a more stable approach, you'd expect to see something like define clear evaluation criteria, test models against those criteria, require auditing, enforce data protection, mandate transparency about refusals and safety tuning, and set up an appeals process when systems are used in government workflows that affect citizens. That way, any lab, Anthropic, OpenAI, Google, open source providers can compete on a level playing field. And that brings us to a question people often miss. Is the government trying to buy the smartest model or the most governable model? Those are not always the same thing. A governable model is one that can be monitored, audited, constrained, and updated predictably. It supports logging. It supports policy controls. It supports data residency and security compliance. It has clear documentation. It has a vendor that will sign contracts with teeth. Sometimes the most cutting-edge model is less governable because it's new, rapidly changing, and less understood. Sometimes the safety-first lab is more governable, precisely because they've invested in safety tooling. But governability can also be interpreted as controllability, and that's where politics enters again. Who gets to decide what the model must refuse? Who gets to decide what is misinformation? Who gets to decide what is harmful? This is where the AI to AGI to ASI arc becomes more than science fiction. As systems become more capable, the alignment problem, the question of how to make AI reliably pursue human-intended goals without unintended side effects, becomes more urgent. But alignment itself isn't purely technical. It's social, it's political, it's ethical. It requires answering whose values, which trade-offs, what oversight, what recourse. If an administration is willing to issue an order targeting a specific safety-oriented lab, we should ask whether that is a move toward clearer governance or toward politicized governance. And you don't have to be pro-Anthropic or anti-Anthropic to care about that. Because if this can happen to one vendor under one administration, it can happen to another vendor under the next. And that means long-term AI policy could become unstable by default. Now, what might be the near-term effects? First, agencies and contractors might switch to other model providers. That could include other large proprietary vendors or, depending on the context, open source models hosted in secure environments. Each alternative has different risk profiles. Some are more permissive, some are more locked down, some may be cheaper, some may be easier to run on-prem, some may have different data retention policies. The practical result is that stop using isn't a neutral change. It can change the behavior of systems embedded in government work. Second, it sends a chilling or rallying signal to the AI industry. If labs believe their political positioning can cost them government access, they may adjust messaging and policy posture. That could mean relaxing some safeguards to avoid accusations of censorship. Or it could mean doubling down on safety and aligning with a different set of political allies. Either way, the industry becomes more political.
Third, it could accelerate the debate around federal AI standards. When a high-profile ban happens, it creates pressure for clearer rules. Some lawmakers and agencies will want to codify what counts as acceptable safety practice. Others will want to codify protections against viewpoint discrimination or excessive restrictions. We may see competing AI Bill of Rights style frameworks, one emphasizing harm prevention, another emphasizing free expression and anti-censorship. Fourth, it raises international questions. If the U.S. politicizes AI vendor selection, allies might hesitate to align with U.S. standards. Rivals might exploit perceived instability. And global companies might try to straddle both sides, complicating cross-border governance. Underneath all of that is the fundamental transition we're living through. AI is moving from being a tool people use to an infrastructure layer societies depend on. And when something becomes infrastructure, it becomes contested. Electricity was contested, telecom was contested, the internet was contested. Not because the technology itself votes, but because whoever controls the infrastructure controls the channels through which people communicate, work, and organize. AI, especially as it approaches AGI-like capabilities, becomes the next infrastructure layer. If it mediates decision-making, knowledge retrieval, and even scientific discovery, then control over AI isn't just about convenience, it's about power. So what should listeners take away from this? 1. Separate the specific from the systemic. The specific is one reported order involving one vendor. The systemic is the growing reality that AI governance is being shaped by procurement choices and political battles, not just by technical standards. 2. Be careful with the word safety. Ask, safety from what? Safety for whom? And who decides? Those questions aren't rhetorical. They determine whether safety becomes a universal baseline or a partisan club. 3. Demand standards over vendettas. If a model is insecure, prove it and set the bar. If a model mishandles data, enforce compliance. If a model's refusals interfere with legitimate government work, measure it and address it with transparent criteria. Bans may sometimes be necessary, but if bans become the default mode of AI governance, we will end up with a fragmented, politicized model layer, precisely when we need stable institutions for the leap toward more capable systems. And now let's bring it home to the AI to AGI to ASI arc. We're in the AI phase where models are already reshaping workflows and discourse, but our governance mechanisms are still primitive and reactive. The AGI phase, if and when it arrives, won't politely wait for Congress to catch up. It will amplify everything: the benefits, the risks, the incentives to politicize, and the consequences of instability. And the ASI phase, if it's possible, raises the stakes beyond any single vendor or election. At that point, the question isn't which chatbot does an agency use, it's do we have institutions capable of steering intelligence more powerful than our own? That might sound dramatic, but governance always looks dramatic right before it becomes normal. The internet once sounded dramatic, social media governance once sounded dramatic. Now we live with the consequences of choices made when those systems were just tools. We are at that same moment with AI, except the system we're building doesn't just transmit information, it generates it, synthesizes it, and increasingly acts on it. So if a political order can reshape which AI models the government is allowed to use, that's not merely an enterprise software story. It's an early signal of how contested the path to AGI will be. It's a reminder that alignment isn't only a math problem, it's a governance problem. And it's a warning that if we don't build clear, durable standards now, standards that can survive administrations, survive market cycles, survive the next leap in capability, then the transition from AI to AGI may be guided less by wisdom and more by power struggles. And in a world where ASI is even a remote possibility, power struggles over intelligence are not a game.